This is WFYI News Now. It's September 30th, and I'm Abriana Herron. On today's show, 25 endangered ground squirrels are released at a nature preserve. Lawmakers consider changes in the ways homeowners associations operate. And we'll find out who became Indiana's Teacher of the Year.
If I had one counselor or one teacher that said, "You're amazing, and I can't wait to be at your graduation for college," like that could be life-changing for one kid, right?
Those stories coming up. But first, a federal judge has temporarily halted enforcement of a 2023 Indiana law that criminalizes anyone who gets within 25 feet of an on-duty police officer after being told to stop. Lawmakers argued it was meant to protect police. A group of media organizations and Indianapolis newspaper and television stations sued the state last year over the law. Judge James Sweeney says the measure is unconstitutionally vague. He says it allows police to order someone to move back at least 25 feet for any or no reason at all. Sweeney also says the law doesn't identify any behavior that would require police to order someone to move back, and his ruling says law enforcement, quote, cannot expect to operate with a 25-foot force field around them, end quote. There is a separate lawsuit over the buffer law filed by a citizen in South Bend. That case is currently before the federal 7th Circuit Court of Appeals. The Indiana Department of Natural Resources released 25 endangered ground squirrels at Kankakee Sands Nature Preserve. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Rebecca Thiel reports partners in the project hope to eventually reestablish the squirrels in its original Northwest Indiana habitat.
The Franklin's ground squirrel looks like a chubbier tree squirrel without the fluffy tail. It lives underground and hibernates about half the year, and unlike prairie dogs, they're not very social, keeping burrows to themselves and their pups. State mammologist for the DNR, Brad Westrich, says farming and development destroyed a lot of the squirrel's prairie habitat and fragmented the populations that are still around.
Being isolated from one another for so long eventually took hold and caused small populations to sort of wink out of existence. And what you have happening there is essentially a loss of genetic diversity, where they're not able to cope with changes
like disease or climate change. Partners in the project say if some of the ground squirrels survive hibernation, have babies, and don't leave the preserve, they'll consider the release a success. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Rebecca Thiel.
If the relocation is successful, the DNR will look for other Indiana prairies where squirrels can be introduced. And Indiana lawmakers took their first steps last week in exploring whether changes are needed in the ways homeowner associations operate. A study committee took testimony that was prompted by concerns from lawmakers like Julie Althoff. Homeowners associations must file their rules, known as covenants, conditions, and restrictions, with their local county. But Althoff says her county recorder told her only about 40% of HOAs are up to date on that requirement.
They're not even doing what they're required to do, and there's nobody watching.
The Indiana Builders Association told lawmakers no changes are needed to the system, but Kelly Elmore from the Community Associations Institute, which advocates for HOAs, says HOAs need more options to enforce their rules.
That allows community associations, when there are violations or other issues in communities, to assess a penalty.
Elmore suggested legislation could also include limits on certain fees and penalties. The study committee likely won't make any recommendations about potential HOA legislation. And for our final story today, the Indiana Department of Education on Friday announced the Teacher of the Year. From WFYI's Education Desk, Sydney Dauphiné has more on the educator for Pike Township Schools in Indianapolis.
Graciela Miranda is an English language learners teacher at Pike High School. Miranda was recognized for her civic engagement and ability to connect with students. She says that growing up as Latina, she wished she had teachers to connect with and guide her. That's part of why she became a teacher.
I struggled reading, and I remember really thinking, I don't want that for someone else. I want something different. But I didn't have any pathway. I didn't know people who could help me navigate into the next steps.
Miranda was surprised with the award by State Secretary of Education Katie Jenner in the Pike High School gym on Friday. The Indiana Teacher of the Year program has been recognizing teachers from across the state for the last 60 years. Miranda will now be considered for the nationwide Teacher of the Year. I'm Sydney Dauphiné.
That's all for today's episode of WFYI News Now. Our podcast is produced by Drew Daudelin, with support from the news team at WFYI and public media journalists across the state. Our news director is Sarah Neal-Estes. Kendall Antron produced our music, and I'm your host, Abriana Herron. If you like today's episode, remember to subscribe and share, and follow WFYI on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube to check in on our newsroom throughout the day. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.